This presentation is intended to be an introduction to Sebastian Faulk's novel Birdsong. It will not cover the novel in extensive detail. It is designed to give you an idea of some of the important characters and the key themes that will help with your annotations of the novel as you read it. It will take you through the narrative structure of the novel, the key characters, the key themes, and the settings, and how the settings within the novel compare and contrast to each other. So we'll start with the narrative structure. The novel is written in 7 parts. We start in France, in Amiens, in 1910, and Stephen is staying with the Ataire family as part of an exploration into some work that he's doing, and he ends up having an affair with the wife of Mr. Ataire, the head of the household. We then go to, after their separation, we then go to part 2, and it's France 1916, and this is the war section of the novel. We're on the front line now. Part 3 is our third time period, and this is with Elizabeth, who is Stephen's granddaughter, in England of 1978. So it offers us an opportunity to see how society has changed as a result of the sacrifices that were made in World War I. We then go back to the front line a year later from part 2, France 1917, and see the development of the war and the ways in which the characters have changed and shifted as a result of their experiences. Part 5 takes us back to England with Elizabeth in 1978 and 1979. We then return to France 1918 and view the final stages of the war and Stephen's part in that, and then returning finally to England in 1979 and finishing with Elizabeth. So part 1, France 1910 in Amiens, in the Ataire household. Some things to look out for and be aware of as you're reading the novel in terms of your annotations. Look out particularly on the opening couple of pages, the protective, lush, pastoral setting of Amiens, because it's important to note how that changes later in the novel. We return to Amiens, but as part of the war in 1914, 1915, and the place has changed significantly. Consider how industrialisation is infringing upon this naturalistic setting and the effect of that. Look at the Ataire's house, how it is imposing, restricting, indestructible seemingly. It's full of secret rooms and passageways. Think about the significance of those. Look out for Stephen's character and this mix of passion and coldness in him. And then consider the idea of childbirth as a form of freedom for Isabel. So Stephen at the start of the novel, he is in some ways cold and animalistic. We get lots of references to this animalistic nature of his. Stephen's body convulsed with desire. Certainly in that word convulsed there is something automatic. Similarly, in For a Moment there was a reflex like an animal. He hardened his heart. Here is a man who is relatively self-controlled, but it is those moments of passion with Isabel that bring out this animalism within him. We get an idea into Stephen's past, just a hint, and it gives us an idea of why he is so cold and detached. He didn't really have a childhood. His own childhood was something that happened to someone else, Isabel reflects, and he had no sentimental attachment to the idea of home. He is essentially an orphan growing up in children's homes. He had no sense of parentage or a sense of home, and so we have a man here who in lots of ways is still finding himself. Stephen has a desire for ending and a desire for certainty. The difference between living and dying was not one of quality, only time. That's a very nihilistic view. He sees the inevitability of death, which becomes significant as he develops as a character during the war sections of the novel. Stephen also has this ongoing fear of birds, and we see that in the early stages of the novel. The sky was filled with the sound of larks, which made him shudder with distaste. He says there's something cruel, prehistoric about them, and I think that is where his fear comes from. It's perhaps the idea that birds in some way represent freedom and endlessness and eternity, and that's what scares Stephen, because he desires ending. Isabel, who Stephen has an affair with in this first section of the novel, she is a woman very much repressed by patriarchal ideals. There was some keener physical life than she was actually living in the calm, restrictive rooms of her husband's house. And then Stephen has a dream where he envisages a trapped bird that he's trying to help out of a window with its wings battering frantically on the glass. This is a clear metaphor for Isabel. Stephen is trying to free her in some way. And Isabel desires that. She wanted to bring alive what she had buried and to demean, destroy her fabricated self. Stephen allows her to do that. He allows her a way to find herself, her true self. And therefore on page 60 she is able to reflect, I am at last what I am, she thought. I was born for this. She finds herself in her affair with Stephen. Part 2, we see a dramatic shift. We go to France 1914 and the front line. Now, two of the key characters in addition to Stephen. Stephen is the protagonist of this novel, but we have Jack Firebrace and Michael Weir, both tunnellers. They both go underground. Now, Fawkes has said in some of his writings about the novel, this was one of his key purposes in writing Birdsong. He wanted to give a voice to the tunnellers who had been so disregarded in terms of their effort in the war, and what they did was crucial, and he wants to give credence to that. So Jack Firebrace, a tunneller, he's kind of the everyman figure. He represents the common soldier. He is also a sacrificial figure. He starts the novel on a wooden cross. He is religious. That's important when we think about religious belief in terms of the war, and we'll touch on that later. He is a character who maintains contact with England fondly. He contacts his wife. He asks for news about his son. He is the one character who maintains the connection between two worlds which are otherwise so far apart. He's popular with the men, probably because he reminds them of home, and he has a very close relationship with Arthur Shaw, and we'll consider the closeness of that relationship later. And then we have Captain Michael Weir. He is in charge of the tunnellers, has found a purpose through war. He feels like he belongs here. He develops a very close relationship with Stephen. But like Stephen, he is distant from his family. And another thing that is significant about Weir is he is sexually naive and inexperienced. He's a virgin. So one of the things to look out for is this. I spoke about the relationship between Jack Firebrace and Arthur Shaw. Look out for these unique fraternal relationships, these friendships which have been reframed in light of a new world. This is a very, very alien existence they are living, and therefore what it means to be a man, what it means to have male friendships has shifted. And at times there are moments where there is the hint of the homosexual about the relationships, but I don't think it is that. It is that they have to be redefined in this very, very unique setting. Don't forget, nobody else can understand what they're going through apart from the men that are going through it with them. If we look at Jack here, Jack stood behind Shaw admiring his huge back above the dimple of the coccyx and the fatty swell of his hair-covered buttocks. That is a really intimate observation on the part of Jack. He is intimate with Arthur Shaw. He curls up behind him. But it's a form of comfort. There's nothing sexual really about that relationship. It's just intensely close. And we're forced to redefine what we understand by male relationships. Similarly, with Weir and Stephen later in the novel on page 240, Weir crawled over the soil and lay his head against Stephen's chest. He said, "Call me by my name." Here, this relationship has been redefined as something like a mother and a son. Weir is looking to Stephen, his male friend, for the comfort that his mother is unable to provide. So we see relationships being redefined. Look out for that in the novel. I'm going to touch on this briefly and we'll consider it more later when we look at Elizabeth's sections of the novel. But we have this gap of experience between the front line and the home front. The idea that nobody back home can truly understand what the men were going through. A, because they haven't experienced it themselves. B, because it is such an alien experience. It is utterly unique. No one has ever seen anything like it before. And importantly, because of the use of propaganda. The people back home are fed lines through the media that they are forced to believe. And there is a reflection from Stephen where he says no one in England knows what this is like. They can't possibly know. And that becomes more and more important later in the novel. Look out for many descriptions of the ways in which the men have been dehumanised by the mechanistic nature of this war. This is the first truly modern conflict. It is a mechanical conflict, and the men likewise become like machines for several reasons. They're being used like weapons of war, but also they become stripped of their humanity. They become desensitized to the effects of warfare, and it becomes an automatic purpose for them. Stephen recognises this is not a war, this is an exploration of how far men can be degraded, stripped of everything they thought they were. Later he watched the men harden to the mechanical slaughter. On page 187 and the preceding pages we get this really vivid description of a young boy in the military hospital, and at the point that he's about to die he let out a high animal shriek. He's been utterly removed from what he was. Look at ideas of memory. Memory is really important in this novel, and one element of that is the way in which the memories of warfare are so vivid and so irremovable. The burned images of the preceding days lived in his memory with static clarity. That's Stephen. And then again on 217, the images retained a fearful static quality that stayed in the mind until death. Static there is the important repetition. It will not move. It is frozen, and the men in many ways are frozen in time. We see with some characters much later in the novel, they're never able to move on from the effects of warfare. Look out for the idea of the disruption of nature and the disruption of the natural order of things. Many descriptions of the sky being full of metal, filling the night sky with a dense traffic of metal. The air overhead was solid metal, the ground trembling with the bombardment. The air overhead was packed with solid noise that did not move. This contrast between the natural world and the man-made weapons that are destroying it. And we see not only a battle between enemies, but a battle between man and nature. Man is destroying nature here, both literally and metaphorically, destroying the soil and destroying what it means to be human, destroying human nature too. And the idea of the natural order being disrupted, it was the way the world had been dislocated. They are creating a new reality here. Nothing will ever be the same again. Religion is an important theme, particularly through the war sections of the novel. And in the first great battle, from about page 210 up to about page 250, we get our first glimpse of the padre, the priest, who comes to comfort the men as they're about to go into battle. The descriptions of him are particularly telling. The padre was standing with bands and prayer book on raised ground like a useless, earthbound bird, one of my favourite similes in the novel. He has lost his purpose. An earthbound bird has lost its purpose. The priest has lost his purpose here. How can religion have a place in a world which is being so utterly violent and destructive? And then finally, even the priest loses that religious belief. He pulled the silver cross from his chest and hurled it from him. Look out for that battle of religion, the conflict of religion in this new world. I mentioned before the new reality that is created, and the world can never go back to what it was before. Stephen, what he longed for was an end to the day and to the new unlivable reality it has brought, and then this was the new reality, the world in which they were now condemned to live, and the pattern of the seasons of night and day was gone. What they previously knew, the normal operating of the world, is gone. They can never return to it. The war has changed that. Part 3, we move on to England in 1978 and to Elizabeth. Elizabeth is Stephen's granddaughter. Things to look out for in these sections of the novel. The mundane nature of modern life, and that acts as a really stark and grating contrast between the mundane nature of warfare, which was so brutal. The mundane nature of the modern existence is so ordinary in comparison that it throws a light on the brutality that the men were living through. There is a lack of regard amongst lots of the characters in this modern section of the novel for the sacrifices that were made. But really what these modern sections are all about is showing us the impossibility of truly connecting with the experiences of World War I and the inappropriateness and ineffectiveness of our attempts to memorialise what happened and the men's sense of sacrifice. It criticises our futile attempts to truly remember and questions how far we go in our attempt to remember. Elizabeth is trying to reconnect, and it is her difficulty which throws a light on quite how impossible that reconnection is. So the mundane nature of modern life, Elizabeth entered a routine so familiar that she found herself talking, smiling and behaving as though by a predetermined programme. Similarly to the soldiers, she's acting automatically now, but there's a real mundanity to this as opposed to the tragedy of what the men have become, and we're forced to question what was it all for if modern life is so prescribed and modern life is so mundane and futile. What was that sacrifice for? Ancient history for? There's a real irony in that line. Ancient history? Well, it's really not ancient history. We are only 60 years on at this point from those horrible experiences. And here's Irene calling it ancient history. It's gone and forgotten. We get the impossibility of reconnecting with the past. Elizabeth really, despite her relatively futile attempt to reconnect, she is the only character in this section of the novel who actually makes an attempt to reconnect with the past and to remember. So we have to have a degree of sympathy for her. But she finds it almost impossible. She finds a number of letters from Stephen in her mother's attic, and then she finds this notebook, this diary, and it's significant that it is written in code. It is written in Greek script. It emphasises how difficult, almost impossible it is to truly understand what they went through. And then we get lots of references in this section to the inappropriate attempts to remember the past. Elizabeth goes to visit the memorial at Thiepval, and this is how it is described. It overpowered the open landscape. The size of it was compounded by its brutal modern design. Although clearly a memorial, it reminded her of Albert Speer's buildings for the Third Reich. The idea of this brutal modern design and a memorial that looks like a building for the Third Reich highlights how inappropriate it is, this attempt to remember those that have died. And that's one of many references. I would encourage you to look at that section on page 264 of the memorial in detail. Lots of evidence there to highlight quite how inappropriate our attempts to remember are. Now that's just a snapshot of what is a deep, rich and utterly brilliant novel, but I hope that it will give you some indication of the sorts of themes you could be looking out for as you read and annotate the novel. I hope you enjoy Birdsong. It's one of my favourite novels of all time. It's utterly brilliant, and I hope you want to read it again and again.